This video is on the central nervous system, focusing on the brain, part 2. So far, we've said that the brain is divided into 4 regions. The cerebral hemispheres, which we can see in this sagittal section right here. We've talked about that. Of course, we've discussed the corpus callosum, the white matter that connects the 2 cerebrums. Here is the lateral ventricle. So again, the cerebral hemisphere is one region, the diencephalon, which you can see right here in blue and purple. The brainstem is shown in green, and lastly, the cerebellum right here in pink. In this video, we're going to focus on the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So let's start with the diencephalon. You can see the diencephalon is kind of tucked underneath the cerebral hemispheres here. And it consists of the thalamus, shown in blue, the hypothalamus, shown in purple, and the epithalamus, which is actually the roof of the third ventricle, which is not shown in this picture. Now, other things that you see here are the choroid plexus, which is producing the cerebral spinal fluid, and also the pituitary gland. The pineal body, which is located right about here, is also found in this area, and we're going to mention that also. All right, let's start with the thalamus, which is a part of the diencephalon. The thalamus consists of 2 egg-shaped structures, and they actually surround the third ventricle containing cerebral spinal fluid. The thalamus is like a relay station for all incoming impulses. So what we really mean is for all sensory input. Okay, so remember that incoming action potentials are actually coming from sensory neurons. What the thalamus does is it takes the information coming in, it sorts it, edits it for errors, and then relays it to the correct part of the cortex for interpretation. Some people compare this to the post office. So if you think about it, letters come into the post office from all over the country. The post office sorts those letters, edits them for perhaps mistakes in zip codes and an address, and then relays them to the right part of the country. The thalamus is kind of like that. And in doing this, it plays a major role in mediating sensation, motor activities. It's also involved in learning and memory. If we take a look at this picture here, this is a posterior view of the diencephalon. And if we look over here, you can see the brain and you can see the thalamus in purple and the brainstem. So we're looking from behind, and you can see that the thalamus consists of these 2 egg-like structures. This is the choroid plexus, which produces the cerebral spinal fluid, and here's the pineal gland. Now, the structures in green we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So the diencephalon consists again of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Hypo, as you remember, means under. So the hypothalamus is under the thalamus. In this area, you can see mammillary bodies, which in humans are 2 small paired nuclei. Remember, nuclei means bunches of cell bodies located in one area within the CNS. And these mammillary bodies kind of bulge anteriorly. They are relay stations for olfactory pathways. Now, in humans, there are 2 small, rounded structures. And they're fairly small compared to the size of the brain. But remember, when you looked in a sheep, if you did the sheep brain dissection, you had 1 large mammillary body. And by large, I mean if you compared the size of the mammillary body to the size of the brain, it takes up a greater percentage. So remember, structure determines function. Why is the mammillary body so much larger in a sheep than in a human? So think about that. Also in this region, you'll find the infundibulum, which is a stalk to which the pituitary gland connected. A lot of times during the sheep brain dissection, it gets the pituitary gland gets pulled off when the dura mater is removed, but you can still see the pituitary gland kind of nestled in the dura mater. The pituitary gland is an endocrine gland that regulates growth, development. It regulates the gonads, the ovaries, and the testes. It does a lot of things. And when you get into A&P2, you're going to go into a lot more detail about the pituitary gland. Okay, so what are some of the functions of the hypothalamus? Well, it is part of the nervous system. So I'm going to say that, part of the nervous system. And in those roles, it regulates blood pressure, the rate of your heartbeat, the force of your heart contraction, digestive tract motility, it controls breathing, and many other visceral activities, meaning activities involved in organs. It is also involved with your perception of pleasure, fear, and rage. It contains the body's thermostat, so it helps maintain, keep your body pressure, temperature within homeostasis. It also regulates feelings of hunger and satiety. Satiety means a sense of fullness. Sense of fullness, okay? And in an interesting study that was done many years ago by, I believe this was psychologists, they took 2 white rats, you can see here, and one of the rats had an unfortunate accident that damaged its hypothalamus. And you can see what happened here. Rats tend to not to overeat. So if you've ever done research with rats, you know that their food tray is always full. It's always full. They only eat what they need. And so this is probably, the rat on the left is a normal size rat. The one on the right is the one whose hypothalamus was no longer able to regulate their feelings of satiety. And you can see what happened here. Even more importantly, the hypothalamus is a major endocrine gland, and you'll learn more about that in A&P2. Lastly, we have the epithalamus, and you might remember this prefix epi means above. So the epithalamus is above the thalamus. It forms the roof of the third ventricle, and in this area you will find the pineal gland, which is an endocrine gland. It secretes a hormone called melatonin. So this is a hormone involved with regulating sleep, getting you to wake up at certain times, and it also plays a role in mood. You may have heard of something called SAD, which is more common in places like New England, but this stands for seasonal affective disorder. And this is when people get kind of depressed in the winter months. So it just so happens that melatonin is produced when it is dark. So when the body is in the dark, you get more production of melatonin. So in New England, of course, we have a lot of dark days in the winter, and so more melatonin is produced. Some people are sensitive to the effects of melatonin, and it can affect their mood in a negative way. Other people aren't affected by it. So some scientists hypothesize it's that this increase in melatonin that causes people to get a little depressed in the winter. Again, this is a hypothesis. It hasn't been fully accepted yet, but there is some information out there to support it. Now, also in this region, you'll find the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is an organ that secretes cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. So that's the diencephalon. Let's move on to the brainstem. Now the brainstem is about 3 inches long. Okay, so maybe the size of your thumb, a little bit bigger, and it attaches to the spinal cord. This provides a pathway for tracts. Now remember that tracts are clusters of axons in the CNS. So inside the CNS. These are clusters of axons, and they run to and from the brain. There are 3 parts to the brainstem, and the first part is called the midbrain. Then we have the pons, and lastly, we have the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata. Okay, so let's look at a sagittal section of the brain again. And again, we have the cerebral hemispheres. We have the diencephalon, which you just went over. And now we're going to talk about the brainstem right here. And you'll notice we've got what's called the midbrain right in here. We have the pons and the medulla oblongata. Below that, we have the spinal cord. Again, this is a posterior view of the brainstem. So we're looking from behind. And now you can see everything in green here is the brainstem. So in this area, you're going to see the midbrain. See, midbrain is right here. And in the midbrain, you've got the corpora quadrigemina. So corpora means body, right? And quad means four. So it means a body of four. 1, 2, 3, 4. The corpora quadrigemina is made up of the superior colliculus, right here, these two, and the inferior colliculus, these two. We also have the pons, which is this area in here, made of what's called peduncles. A peduncle means a stalk. So just that's an odd word, but it means a stalk. But the stalk is really just made of tracts. And then we have the medulla, which is down here. Now, posteriorly, it's kind of hard to distinguish the pons and the medulla. But if you're looking anteriorly from the front, the pons appears as a little bump up here, like a little bump, kind of like that. So you can see it, and you can tell where the pons ends and the medulla begins. So going back to the midbrain, again, it's mostly made of tracts, these clusters of axons. And if you're looking at it, if you're doing a dissection of the sheep brain and looking at it, it's kind of hard to, tell the difference between anything. Everything looks just like white. But in this area are something called the cerebral peduncles. Remember, peduncles are stalks, meaning it's holding something up. But these are really just tracts or clusters of axons. People often use fibers to refer to axons. And they connect the cerebrum to the medulla oblongata. Okay, so these are kind of like telephone lines. Hence the term cerebrum. That's a clue that these tracts connect the cerebrum to something. Now in this area also you will find the corpora quadrigemina, corpora quadrigemina, and consisting of the superior colliculus, and this is involved in visual reflexes. For example, if a ball was flying towards your face, you would blink. So a reflex is a rapid response to a stimulus, which is involuntary. And so when you blink, you're not thinking, oh, a ball is flying towards my face, I better shut my eyes to protect myself. You're not thinking at all. It just happens so fast in response to a visual stimulus. The inferior colliculus is an auditory reflex. And an example of that would be if you were in a classroom and someone at the back of the classroom shouted fire, you would automatically turn around and look at that person. So that's a reflex. It's involuntary and it's rapid. And in this case, you're responding to an auditory stimulus. So when you did the sheep brain dissection, you may have noticed that the corpora quadrigemina in general are really big compared to the size of the brain. They make up a large portion of it. If you look in humans, the colliculi are fairly small compared to the size of the brain. So these kinds of reflexes are more important apparently in animals. In this area, you'll also find the cerebral aqueduct, which is a canal that connects the third and the fourth ventricles. And what it's doing, it's allowing for the passage of cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, the last part of the brainstem is called the pons. And as I said, anteriorly, you can see it kind of bulging anteriorly, not posteriorly. But that's how you can identify it. Again, mostly comprised of fiber tracts or clusters of axons. And these axons are connecting the brain with the spinal cord. So if you look laterally, which means on the side of the pons, you will see what's called the cerebellar peduncles. Now remember, we already talked about the cerebral peduncles, which are tracts connecting the cerebrum to the medulla oblongata. But here, this is cerebellar peduncles. So these tracts are connecting the cerebellum. So it's connecting the cerebellum to the brainstem, and that means to the midbrain. Remember, there are 3 parts to the brainstem, to the pons, and to the medulla oblongata. Okay, so again, these are tracts, which means clusters of axons, connecting the cerebellum to the 3 different parts of the brainstem. So there are 3 different tracts of that make up the cerebellar peduncle. So let's go back for a second. I can show you. Okay, so if we look here, we can see the cerebellar peduncles, 1, 2, 3. So the superior cerebellar peduncles are connecting the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle cerebellar peduncles are connecting the cerebellum to the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncles are connecting the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. So again, the role of these peduncles is to connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. Okay, the last part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata, and it is the lowest part. After this, you kind of merge into the spinal cords. And again, it consists of important fiber tracts or clusters of axons. Kind of hard to tell or see anything different when you're looking at the sheep brain. This is really important in controlling things that keep you physically alive. So for example, it controls your heart rate, your blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, vomiting, things like that. If there is damage to the brainstem, you can see why this could result very rapidly in death. Okay, the last part of the regions of the brain, we've talked about the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and now we're just going to mention the cerebellum. So you can see in this sagittal section, the cerebellum is right here, and there are actually 2 mini hemispheres, and they have kind of gyri and sulci, so they're a lot looking like the cerebrum. They make up 7% of the brain's mass, and they're dorsal to the pons and the medulla oblongata. So the cerebellum has several roles. One of the roles is it plays a part in language and problem solving. It also recognizes and predicts sequences of events. So for example, this is a test that I remember from kindergarten. So one of the questions was circle the sequence, or circle where there's a pattern. And so what you have to do is do that. So that's an example of predicting a sequence of events, and I'm sure you can think of other examples in your life. Another role is involuntary coordination of body movements. Now remember, control of body movements is done by the skeletal system. Remember that? Specifically by skeletal muscles. Oops, let's make skeletal muscles. And remember, this is completely voluntary body movement. But this isn't about moving muscles. This is about the coordination of body movements. Coordination. And this is the part that is involuntary. So for example, if you were to get up out of your chair and walk across the room, that involves the contraction of several different muscles. So some muscles are going to contract with different amounts of force. Some muscles are going to stretch, and they're going to do so in a particular order. That coordination is not something that is done voluntarily. And they call this cerebellar processing. So for example, if you're sitting in a chair and you decide you're going to get up and walk to the refrigerator and open the door, the first thing that happens is your cerebellum receives impulses, meaning nerve impulses, of the intent to move. So the cerebellum gets a message, oh, the body wants to get up and walk over to the refrigerator. Then Proprioceptors and visual signals inform the cerebellum of the body's condition in space. Proprioceptors are found in skin, muscles, and joints. And they basically provide the brain with information about where the limbs and the body are at that point in time. They can also provide information about force, sense of heaviness, things like that. But anyways, the cerebellum gets that information, so it knows where the legs are and the arms and the torso, all of that. And then it calculates the best way to perform the movement. So in other words, it decides which muscles have to move and with which amount of force, which have to relax, and what is the order of the muscular movement. That's kind of complicated. So it sends a blueprint of what movements are needed to the cerebral motor cortex for it to carry out. That is what cerebellar processing is. A lot of people compare it to an autopilot on a plane. You know, where the pilot is driving and then he wants to take a coffee break, so he sets the plane on autopilot, meaning he's still in control, but a computer is doing all the calculations.